The Disneyland website invites guests to zigzag in a motor car with J. Thaddeus Toad, Esquire, on a manic drive through the countryside. It's a simple, modest description for a simple, modest attraction. But don't let it fool you. Mr. Toad's has a deep and meaningful place in the history of Disneyland. And in this episode of Fresh Baked, we're going to share with you the secrets and history of this legacy attraction. When Disneyland construction was complete and the park opened in July of 1955, it was clear that Fantasyland was the center, the focus of the park. Once guests began their walk up Main Street, their eyes are immediately drawn to Sleeping Beauty Castle, the icon of Disneyland, the face of Fantasyland. And with the other lands being a bit of a mystery, something of a discovery for guests who didn't know what a jungle cruise was or a mission to the moon, Fantasyland was left to do some heavy lifting. Something familiar was needed, so 3 dark rides were built in the heart of Fantasyland based on Disney films guests would immediately recognize. The Scary Adventures of Snow White, Peter Pan's Flight, and Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. Mr. Toad's Wild Ride was based on the animated short The Wind in the Willows as part of a 1949 package film titled The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. The short film was an adaptation of the Kenneth Grahame novel of the same name and followed the escapades of Mr. J. Thaddeus Toad, who was an incurable adventurer, one obsessed with fads. And in this story, his particular obsession is with a new invention, the automobile. Along the way, Mr. Toad steals a motor car and begins terrorizing the countryside, driving like a mad toad. And despite the best efforts of his friends Angus McBadger, Ratty, and Molly, Toad finds himself in jail. Now, there's a little more to this story, but that is enough to sort of set the scene for our ride in 1955 Disneyland. It may surprise some to learn that Toad's was not originally intended to be a dark ride, but actually a roller coaster. Well, as much as a roller coaster could be for a kid's ride in Fantasyland back in that day. There was, for example, to be a bit of downhill track with your vehicle heading straight for some parked cars, but then they would suddenly move away at the last second. Walt, though, changed his mind, opting instead for the attraction to be much more kid-friendly, along with, the rest of the Fantasyland dark rides. What we got instead is a Mr. Toad's ride that is both just as we know it today, but also one that was surprisingly different. In some ways, one could say that Toad's is the oldest ride in the park, in the way that one twin is born before the other. In the case of Mr. Toad's, its parts were among the very first to be delivered to Disneyland as construction began. Meanwhile, Bob Gurr is believed to have said to CM's working Toads to be careful with those parts as they're the oldest ones in the park. And thus, Mr. Toad's Wild Ride is a member of an exclusive group of attractions, legacy attractions as they're known. Attractions that were operating on opening day in July of 1955. Now, you might recognize some of the names responsible for building this ride, names you've heard in other history videos. Names like Ken Anderson, Claude Coates, Yale Gracie, Bill Martin, and Robert Matty. Now, if I were to tell you that Mr. Toad's ride that you enjoy today is the same as that which was enjoyed in 1955, you would probably be inclined to believe me. It certainly does feel like a vintage attraction, and it is, of course, but it has also gone through its share of renovations and upgrades. Here's how things looked in 1955. Along with the rest of Fantasyland, the facades were designed with that medieval tournament appearance. In this photo, you can see the ride vehicles on the left side of the ticket booth, and then just outside of the barrier is the queue. And while the medieval theme may look completely foreign to most of you, the ride vehicles shouldn't. They haven't changed much at all since 1955. These vehicles were designed to resemble the 1900s era motor cars, just like the kind that Thaddeus himself might have stolen and taken for a joyride. I mentioned that the 1955 version of the ride was more than a little different than we know today. Well, that's because most of the more animated features weren't installed until the updates done in 1961 and 83. The original ride was pretty short and simple, just 98 seconds long, with very basic gags and even less technology. There was no depth artistically. Everything was done in profile on wooden flats. No three-dimension effects like guests might find, let's say, in Peter Pan. But then, those were necessary for a ride like Peter Pan, where guests fly above the sets rather than alongside them on the ground. Then there was the customary dark ride features like ride vehicles crashing through doors. But then, Even that tech was primitive, where on occasion, your ride vehicle would literally hit that barn door feature and push it open. Other gags you might have found in the original attraction were the wobbly barrels and the train headlight headed right for you, though its execution was a little different originally. That's a picture of Yale Gracie demonstrating the simplicity of this gag. And I personally was surprised to learn that the scene in hell has been there since opening day. Again, not as we know it today, as there was no judge, just this warm welcome with fabric flames, while the cow devils that we've seen before were just wooden flats. Now you might ask at this point, if you know anything about the original short film, why this scene even exists in the Disneyland attraction, because it doesn't exist in either the Disney animated film or the original novel. Well, it's believed that Walt approved of this addition himself, as suggested by Imagineers, as he felt that there should be some kind of consequence for Toad's reckless behavior. And there you go, an answer to a question that so many fans have asked. And this is a good point to talk about the comparison of the Disneyland ride to the original film on which it's based. Of course, the characters that we see on the ride are directly from the film, but the chronology of events are not at all similar. In fact, the events in the film don't really appear at all in the ride, or vice versa. Only the characters and the settings share anything in common. It feels like the animated short, but it really isn't at all. It turns out that Disney wasn't necessarily trying to do what some might call a book report ride, where they simply retell the story of the film as it happens. Think Pinocchio or Ariel's Undersea Adventure. In this case, the goal with Mr. Toad's was simply to take you on a motorcar adventure. Sure, there are scenes with which we're familiar, but the tone of the ride isn't the story, it's the wild ride. And they achieved this mostly with the narrowest possible turn radius of 4 feet, which obviously creates some really sudden turns throughout the ride. Ones where you're narrowly escaping those wobbly barrels, or those shipping boxes labeled acid, or explosives, or TNT, or nitro, or blasting powder. And of course there's the signs that urgently tell guests, do not enter, one way, halt, or turn back. Meanwhile, guests are left bewildered and lost, whistles blowing, headlights coming right at you, and you're going to Not So Shy or even to Nowhere in particular. All those things added together help to achieve that feeling of recklessness and mayhem and mania that the ride is trying to convey. Now, like a lot of things born at Disneyland in 1955, updates were quickly needed and made to Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. The first round of updates came in 1961 when Disney added a few more gags, a few characters, and some slightly improved tech. More character flats were added, including Angus McBadger, Molly, and some police officers. Meanwhile, new crash doors were added, including a construction barricade in the village and breakaway crates and kegs in the warehouse. And now, instead of motor cars pushing the doors open, relays were installed to trigger their opening remotely. There were more changes to come, but before these occurred, Walt Disney World in Florida got a Mr. Toad's ride of their own in 1971. It was more or less the same as the Disneyland version, but with one major exception. They built 2 tracks instead of 1. But this version of Mr. Toad's didn't have quite the same staying power for some reason, as it was closed in 1998 in favor of a Winnie the Pooh dark ride. A travesty for sure, but it only helped grow the legend that is Mr. Toad's in Disneyland. Meanwhile, back in Disneyland, Thaddeus was about to see an aggressive makeover to his wild ride, a makeover that was part of an entire remodel for Fantasyland. In 1983, gone was the medieval tournament theme, and in came a proper Toad Hall exterior. Actually, each of the Fantasyland dark rides were given their own unique exteriors that matched their given source film. And what a fantastic update it was. The Toad Hall facade was beautifully redone, as well as the interiors that put you practically in Toad's living room. The new facade was achieved by essentially extending the front of the building further out into the Fantasyland walkways. Then additional space was found so they could also lengthen the ride and create a beautifully rendered outdoor queue. Where there was once just simple switchbacks under a canopy, as generic a queue as could be, there is now this lovely area outside and to the left of the ride with a covered trellis and busts of all the major Mr. Toad's characters, each with a little comment describing their personalities. As we enter the new queue, we can now find Toad's coat of arms with the motto, Toady acceleratio semper absurda, or speeding with Toad is always absurd. In the original attraction, there was a mural for guests to enjoy while waiting in the queue, and in the new queue, there was a new mural depicting some scenes from the film and the ride, including our trip to hell, and also including this delightful little nod to Walt Disney himself, lover of trains, and the proprietor of Wed Railway. Then there's Mr. Toad himself, standing proud in a nook of the queue, acting as a sort of a mascot, a Buddha, if you will, whose belly you might rub as you walk by. Now, some say you can even find a hidden Mickey on this statue, and if you look closely at his right eye, you might find it. There's another hidden Mickey in the rafters, in the detail, though this one might be a bit harder to see with the naked eye. And of course, there are all kinds of updates made to the ride itself. In fact, the entire track was ripped up and the show building interior was gutted, which is amazing to think about it when you consider that being in the ride today, one would have no doubt believing that this is exactly as it was 50 years ago. But no, the interior and the track are actually as new as 1983. Now, along with the track and interiors getting a refresh, new gags and new scenes were added. There's obviously the opening crash through the fireplace in the Toad Hall Library as you begin your ride. The scene following Mr. Winky's pub with the Green Dragon Inn, as well as that statue of Toad and Cyril, are new to the ride. The guilty verdict from the evil prosecutor and these few seconds in prison are new as of 1983. And then the prosecutor appears again in hell, along with a much more fully realized set, new props, and 3D cow devils, which, by the way, are so nicknamed due to their horns, little barbed tails, and their pear-shaped bodies that make them look like little tiny cows. And with these updates, the ride has remained unchanged since 1983, and with that, we conclude this story of the secrets and history of Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, a ride that has found a way to stay in the hearts of Disneyland fans for more than 65 years without boasting even a whisper of cutting-edge technology. Whatever the opposite of cutting edge is, that's Mr. Toad's, and I think I speak for most of us when I say I wouldn't have it any other way. Thank you very much for joining us today, and until next time, please do be sure to like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe to our channel, and fresh baked!